Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for the virtual water cooler chat for Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, led by Clarence Moriwaki. Mr. Moriwaki is the founder of the Bainbridge Island Japanese American community and has been a spokesperson to the White House. Please let us know where you're joining us from in the chat. Today's talk is hosted by Virtual Patent Gateway with sponsorship from TransPerfect Legal Solutions. You're welcome to stay on camera for today's session. And with that, I'll hand things over to VPG's principal and founder, Ashley Chung.
Let's make sure I'm not muted this time. Hi, I'm Ashley Chung, principal and founder of Virtual Patent Gateway. Welcome everyone for spending this afternoon for this virtual water cooler chat with us. And we are really overjoyed to welcome Mr. Clarence Moriwaki to discuss with us or do a quick presentation on the Let's Not Let It Happen Again. And before I turn the floor over to Mr. Moriwaki and Clarence, I wanted to thank Holly Brewer for securing the witness. You can tell that I'm in the legal industry, the speaker. And then Victoria for helping us to do the social media promotion. And Caitlin always for helping me with the webinar, all the specialties. And without further ado, let me turn this over to Clarence.
Well, thanks so much. And, I don't know what crime I've been charged with. I'm not sure. You guys will let me know when that happens. Do this on behalf of Humanities in Washington. I'm sure all of you have either, certainly watched or produced or presented a PowerPoint presentation. So I'm giving you fair warning right from the start that this is a PowerPoint presentation. So I certainly hope you don't find mine too torturous. I call it the story of 4 H's: history, honor, healing, and hope. We start with the history on Bainbridge Island. It begins with the Suquamish people here in the Salish Sea. It's been renamed Puget Sound by the Europeans. And they've been in this region for about 10,000 years. And Bainbridge Island was one of their places that was in their territory of travel. And their most famous son was Chief South, who was the namesake for the city of Seattle. The first Europeans did not arrive into our region until 1792. This is an artist's depiction of Captain George Vancouver's HMS Discovery. The United States did not arrive to this area until 1941. It was a ship chartered by the U.S. Lieutenant Navy Charles Wilkes. He circumnavigated our island, named it after his good friend Commodore William Bainbridge, who never set foot in our state. What they found in this region were massive natural resources, these old-growth forests, and everywhere from British Columbia down to California. They would take advantage of these by building mills anywhere near water, and that certainly was the place here on Bainbridge Island. This is Blakely Harbor, and that's a Blakely Harbor mill, and at its peak at the end of the 19th century, this was the largest lumber mill in the entire world. In the back, what looks like burned out trees is actually the Hall Brothers shipyard further up harbor. These two businesses were the largest industries in central Puget Sound for a while. They had electricity 10 years before Seattle did. It brought people in from all around the world, from Europe, Croatians, Swedes, Norwegians, the Japanese, Chinese, Filipinos, Native Americans, and African Americans, and they all worked together in both the mill and the shipyard, which are very dangerous places. So the tight-knitness of these people working together was very paramount to their own survival. The Census Bureau came by in the 1880s. They found names like mine, Moriwaki, or other Japanese names too hard to spell or pronounce, so they simply, for many, many years, knew you as just a number. Here's a picture of what Port Blakely looked like at its peak at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Above the words Blakely Harbor, you'll notice that's where the Hall Brothers shipyard is. And you go to its left, over to the mouth of the harbor, you'll see where the Blakely Harbor Mill is. I'm going to focus on the lower left part of this map, the Japanese pioneer towns of Nagaya and Yama. When the first Japanese came in the 1880s, those men worked in the area of Nagaya, and then when their wives and picture brides came over, they started families. They wanted to have them separate from those men, and so they built a town up the hill called Yama, and which is what Japanese means. Yama means mountain or hill. A lot of people took a lot of pride in their businesses. And the Japanese came in the 1880s because of a huge recession. Now, all the others were very skilled workers in the mill and or shipyard, and the Japanese were no different, except many of them came and they were business people. They ran businesses. They were retired generals. And so they basically started the company town. They started the Washington Hotel and Restaurant. There was a bathhouse. There was a grocery store. There's Mr. Takeyoshi. He had his mercantile business. And the one business that was very popular, both mill workers and their children, was the ice cream parlor that Mr. Takeyoshi ran. The mill had burned down twice in its iteration in the early 1920s when it burned down for its final time. Most of the old growth forest had pretty much been decimated and cut, and that mill was built just for old growth timbers. So people had to find other things to do, and the Japanese on Bainbridge Island started farming. This is a picture of the strawberry farms on Bainbridge Island. And they also continued their entrepreneurship. This is a picture of Bainbridge Gardens, which was not only gardens, but you can see a purpose-built grocery store. And it also had the first gas station on Bainbridge Island. And it was also a very closed ecosystem here on Bainbridge Island. So people worked together from the beginning when they had the industries. And then when they started having the island spread out, farming and other businesses, they would start shopping and buying within the island itself. So it was a very tight-knit community. And another thing that was tight-knit, when they started their public schools on Bainbridge, it was compulsory, well before even the state of Washington required it. So this was a very integrated community. I would suggest to you that no child is born prejudiced. And so the island is moving along very well. And then December 7th, 1941 was the day when the Imperial forces of Japan came to the U.S. territory of Hawaii, and at Pearl Harbor bombed the Sixth Fleet. On that day and the day after, the FBI raided not only the territory of Hawaii, but 23 cities. And without any search warrants or any charges or even suspicions of crimes, they took away elders and they took whatever they felt like taking. They called it contraband. So they took their radios, shotguns, cameras, anything that they felt might be used by spies, and other personal items. On Bainbridge Island, the FBI arrived on February 4th, 1942, and with the assistance of the Kitsap County Sheriff's Department and their deputies and the Washington State Patrol, they raided all 50 Japanese-American homes on Bainbridge simultaneously, which is quite a feat 80 years ago, since most of the roads had no names. They were farm roads, after all. And so someone on the island was giving them actionable intelligence on where to go. They took away 38 of our elders, and they raided almost every Japanese-American home. The FBI did without any warrants or searches. And they were able to do this because in the late 1930s, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, had started surveilling everybody of 1/16th Japanese ancestry. And then a baby would be born, the FBI created a brand new file on you. So they had all of this actionable data, and it was not found out until 2007 that the U.S. Census Bureau had been giving the FBI the census data, which helps explain how they were so sufficient and efficient to come to Bainbridge Island. Here's a map of what they did just days after Pearl Harbor. You'll note it's dated December 9th, and you can see the cities, the number of people they took away on those on morning and just 48 hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. A couple of days after Pearl Harbor, on December 11th, 1942, the Western Defense Command was created. Here's its first commander, Lieutenant General John DeWitt. And what this allowed was military authorities to exclude civilians from any area without any trial or hearing. About a month later, after the founding of the Western Defense Command, FDR signed, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States, signed Executive Order 9102. It established the War Relocation Authority. It was a civilian agency in charge of designing, building, and then administrating the incarceration and concentration camps. Milton Eisenhower was its first director. A couple months after Pearl Harbor, in a week, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic president, signed Executive Order 9066, and it said the order stated that all persons of Japanese ancestry, it's created, the motion for civilian exclusion orders, and the first one arrived here on Bainbridge Island a month after that order was signed. And the order stated that all persons of Japanese ancestry will be removed in 6 days. You will only be allowed to take what you could carry or wear. And they had to register at the Anderson Hardware Store, which is now the Pegasus Coffee Shop. This is March 25th, the day after that poster was put up. This picture was taken that day as well. This is Mr. and Mrs. Evansto Eroto, and I would suspect that after this photograph was taken, they weren't smiling because Mr. Eroto, since he was a Filipino-American, was told that he could not go with his Japanese-American wife, Miki. And it's been reported that he protested vigorously, that he pleaded with the military authorities. He even was reported to have said, I will renounce my U.S. citizenship. I will do whatever it takes to be with my wife. But the military said, no, you're not 1/16 Japanese, so you have to stay back. Everybody had just 6 days to figure out what to do with their properties. Here's Hiroshi Amatsu with his property. The Japanese, because of this tight-knit, again, quality of this community, every Japanese farmer who had a neighbor or friend was willing to look after their property, promised to pay for their taxes. So that was looked after. Finally, the ferry arrived on March 30th, 1942 to Bainbridge Island. If you cannot arrive at the Eagle Dale Ferry dock, the government would take you there on a troop carrier. And here's a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Pardon me, excuse me. And so they had a dog. They had a dog. And they didn't have any children, but they had a dog that was basically their child. And people knew King because he was a white Samoyed, rather exotic animal at the time. And he was kind. He never bit. He never barked. Children could ride on his back, but they would not allow the dog to go. So the two soldiers there had to remove the dog, and the dog tried to chase them as the truck was being taken away. But they had their property looked after by their neighbor, and the neighbor said, of course, we'll look after your dog, King. But this healthy 5-year-old dog was so despondent and sad that he refused to eat or drink, and he died in a week. So high school seniors came down to say goodbye to their classmates. They'd grown up with them. They were all born here together. And the soldiers over those 6 days became very, very close to the Japanese Americans on the island. And this is a picture of one of them holding one of the children. And the Bainbridge Review publisher editor, Walt Woodward, reported on that day, interviewing the commanding officer of the soldiers from New Jersey, saying, we don't know why we're here. We don't know why we're doing this. This is the hardest thing we've ever had to do. And Woodward also noticed that all soldiers had tears in their eyes. The ferry is out of picture. I mean, the ferry dock is out of picture. To the left of this photograph, you can see the soldiers marching down to greet the ferry. All of the Japanese Americans are assembled up in the upper parking lot. You can see some of the cars where people drove either the Japanese American families' cars and or them brought them themselves. And then the ferry arrived at 11:03. 227 marched down to the ferry. The ferry went over to Seattle. They arrived at where the current ferry dock is, at Coleman Dock in Seattle. Thousands of people came to watch them. This is the Hayashida saying goodbye to the area. They went for 3 days and 2 nights. They had to keep the blinds closed all the way down, and they arrived in the Owens Valley between Los Angeles and Lake Tahoe at Lone Pine, where they would then ride a bus for 2 more hours and arrive here at the Manzanar concentration camp, where they would be the first persons to live in a concentration camp. This was on April 1st, April Fool's Day, 1942. They had just enough barracks for those 227, but they were still building them. You might notice this picture in the corner. This was taken the day after they arrived on April 2nd, 1942. These barracks were very hastily built. They were 100 feet by 20 feet. And broken up into 4 sections, so therefore it would be a 25 by 20 section. You can see it's just basically like a shed. There's the wood on the outside. There's tar paper on that, and that is all. There's no insulation. There's no sheetrock, and the floors were the same. You had this 25 by 20 foot area. You had 1 bare light bulb and 1 stove. And the wall didn't go up to the ceiling. So basically you were inside a large barn with up to 32 other people, 8 people per unit. And you just made do with what you could in those spaces. This is a model of what Manzanar looked like at its full build out. This is at the Japanese National American Museum in Los Angeles. And by September of 1942, more than 10,000 Japanese Americans were crowded into these 504 barracks. You can see they're organized into blocks. There's 36 of them. And in the center, you can see 2 smaller buildings. That would be the separate male and female latrines. The longer building would be the mess hall. And then the next one would be the shared laundry facility. All 10 of these concentration camps were located in faraway places as far east as Arkansas. And while they were in different locations, They all had one thing in common: very, very far away from anything. And also in the summers, very hot, blowing sandstorms or dust storms. And in the winter, just the opposite. No pavement, of course, or no gravel. So the snow and or rain would just be basically a mud basin all those months. There's also a lack of privacy. You can see the toilets are very close together. All 10 camps had different stories, but all 10 camps remarkably have a shared memory. And that's a memory of an elderly person walking to the latrines at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. It's not that these elderly people were noisy. It's because the searchlights would go across the grounds all the time against the barracks. But once they saw someone move, they would spotlight you as if you were in the middle of a Broadway stage and follow you all the way to the latrine. And people would notice the searchlights would stop. Many would wake up and watch an elderly person being followed to the latrine. And then the spotlight would stay on the latrine door and then follow them back to the barracks. And this happened every night practically in all of the camps, because this first generation of Japanese wanted their privacy. That was modesty, and those kind of things were very important. And so this was a time when they could be alone without strangers, to have just one moment of dignity. Another thing that the elders had a hard time with was eating with other people. You ate in large mess halls, and eating together as a family is a strong Japanese tradition. It's really part of the heritage to build and bond and share together. And this started a disintegration of a lot of family units. A lot of these young people started hanging out with kids from all around other different parts of the country, and they'd go to different blocks where the food was better or where their friends were. And the parents, for the most part, had to deal with it because they did not know how long they'd be here. 6 months, 6 years, maybe the rest of their lives. So they wanted lives as normal as possible for their children. So they allowed that. And education was very important to the culture. So they made sure they had schools, converting barracks into schoolrooms, and the activities that you would have outside of barbed wire as if you were back home. So music and sports and the general activities that you would normally see, and try to keep the kids active. Again, all 10 camps had different ways of dealing with it, but they all loved the American pastime baseball. All 10 camps, the incarcerees themselves, built their own baseball diamonds. And so all 10 camps had baseball teams. Here's a map of the forced removal area. In Washington State out here, there's a bend in the middle. That's the Columbia River, and it joins a highway going north to Canada. It goes a little bit into eastern Oregon and all of California and southern Idaho. And that's that pink area. If you were in that area to the west of that boundary in the dark pink and 1/16 Japanese American, you would be forcibly removed. That was 114,000 people. And you can see the 10 triangles. Those are the 10 concentration camps and their locations throughout the United States. Throughout the war, another 6,000 children would be born in one of those 6 or 10 triangles. So all told, it was a little over 120,000 Japanese Americans taken to these camps and forcibly removed, none inside the boundary on the far west coast. That was about 95% of all Japanese Americans in the entire continental U.S. Now, of course, we were at war with Italy and Germany. About 14,000 were incarcerated, 10,000 German nationals, German Americans, and 4,000 Italian Americans were captured, but they were all charged with, suspected of, or convicted of some sort of crime, espionage, sedition, whatever. Not one person of Japanese ancestry was ever charged with anything. And there were about 14 million German and Italians in the U.S. So that was basically about 0.1% of their total population. You can see quickly here, the Bainbridge Islanders first went to Manzanar. After about a year, most of them transferred to Minidoka because they wanted to get away from all of the Los Angeles urban Japanese Americans that came to Manzanar. They did not get along with them. They were country mice and they were the city mice. The editor of the Bainbridge Island Review said this was a really good move because everyone knows that you should not mix Washington apples with California lemons. Now, before the concentration camps would be built, and I showed you that picture of Manzanar still under construction, those 10 triangles weren't ready for all of these folks. So the Bainbridge Islanders said, yes, we were the first ones in a concentration camp, but at least we went to a concentration camp, if you can believe it, because it wasn't an assembly center. And here in Washington State, this is the assembly center. And assembly centers in orange in this map, that's Seattle and Pierce County to the south. They went to the Puyallup Fairgrounds. And dark blue, Kitsap and most of King County went to the Pinedale Assembly Center in Fresno, California. In green, the rest of Western Washington went to the Tule Lake Camp in Northern California, which later became a full concentration camp. And in light blue, Eastern Washington went to the Portland, Oregon Fairgrounds. There were also places like the Santa Anita racetrack, other racetracks, other fairgrounds that these people were sent to, and they could not build the barracks in those locations fast enough as well. So the first several thousand who arrived at the Portland Fairgrounds or the Puyallup Fairgrounds, they were placed into the animal stalls where horses, cows or pigs had previously been in there. Some cases, they just removed the livestock the day before those people arrived. And then finally, the what they called relocation to the concentration camps were finally built. And here in Washington State, in Red and Pierce County, they went to the Minidoka camp in southern Idaho. That's why the Bainbridge Islanders wanted to go there, because they had so many friends and family from the Seattle area. Rest of Western Washington was already at the Tule Lake camp. In Eastern Washington, they got moved to the Hart Mountain, Wyoming camp, which at its peak, Hart Mountain was the largest camp or largest city in Wyoming. This is the peak population of all of those camps. It does not include the war relocation civilian personnel, or nor the U.S. Army military guards of those places, which were thousands throughout these camps. They tried to make their lives as normal as possible. Here's Kesakaina Cow. She was our oldest survivor. She just passed away last year at 100. And they came to the camps and asked people to join the military. Here's Art Kura. He joined out of the 276 Bainbridge Islanders. 68 either were enlisted or drafted into the military, 66 men and 2 women. Art was one of the 18 from our island that joined the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. This is a team of extreme valor in the European theater, all segregated Japanese-American unit. 2 things of note that changed the tide for opinions of Japanese soldiers. They saved the lost battalion. It was a Texas battalion trapped in the mountains of eastern France. 2 attempts by the Allied forces to save them failed. They were repelled by the Germans and the Italians. And so the 442nd just fought a 4-day war or 4-day battle, arrived there, rested one day, and were ordered to go save the lost battalion. And they did, and they saved 211 out of those 275 soldiers, but 161 of them died. 1,200 had casualties, and 42 were captured by the Nazis. And speaking of Nazis, they were also the first group to liberate the Dachau concentration camp. And when they arrived, this was a quote from one of the survivors who says, "When I made out the American uniforms, I felt unbelievable relief. But as the soldiers approached, I noticed that they weren't like other Americans. They were Asians. I feared that they may be the Japanese army, but I was too tired to run. Then one soldier came up to me, and with sadness and compassion in his eyes, he tried to comfort me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a Hershey bar. At that moment, I knew these were our liberators and that I had survived the war." Now, presidential unit citations are given to units of incredible valor throughout military service, or maybe a ship or another vessel. Only about 5% ever win a presidential unit citation. The 442nd receives 7 of them. This is the 7th being received by President Harry Truman. And he said on that day, "You not only fought the enemy, but you fought prejudice and you won." Again, I mentioned we were also at war with these 2 other nations, but there were no mass civilian exclusion orders for anybody of German or Italian background. That would have certainly changed the course of history for this Italian-American, Joe DiMaggio, or this German-American, Dwight Eisenhower, who led the United States to victory and later became the Republican U.S. president. This is unconstitutional. The 4th Amendment right there is one where you are securing your persons and property. This is the search warrant amendment. There must be a reasonable cause. You must have an order from a court to allow you to come into your home or take anything from your hands possession. Not one search warrant was ever issued to any of the 114,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast. The 5th Amendment's really powerful. Most people know it as the one where you can't testify against yourself, but you can read that for yourself. It's no person shall. And among all democracies and republics, no other document has persons written into its rights. Mostly they say citizens, but we say persons, which is really extraordinary because the first group of people, the first immigrants, were persons. They were denied naturalization, but they're still persons. So they have the rights. And this is an important thing for people to remember in this immigration debate. When you enter from Mexico or Canada, or you get off a cruise ship, you land at an airport, get off a merchant vessel, the minute you set foot on American soil, whether you are from another country, your religion, whatever, it doesn't matter. You have rights in the United States. All persons have rights. You have some sort of due process. And then the 14th Amendment is the Equal Protection Under the Law Amendment. This is where we have all of the rights, which led to the Brown versus Board of Education and equality for all type of actions by the Supreme Court. But most important, the first line. This is if you were born in a U.S. territory, U.S. state, you are a natural born citizen. And the 2/3 of these folks were born here. The children were born and they were U.S. citizens. And J. Edgar Hoover, he's the guy who had been surveilling everybody of 1/16th Japanese ancestry. He said, Mr. President, I got nothing on these. And he went after those 10,000 German nationals and 4,000 Italians. Most people don't know, but in 1939, Madison Square Garden had a standing room only rally of Nazis supporting the Third Reich and supporting Hitler. He was worried about those folks. And to his credit, Attorney General Biddle challenged the president saying, Mr. President, we'll have 75,000 lawsuits. This executive order is unconstitutional. And yet, people took this to court. They took their cases to court, and the Supreme Court upheld the executive order as constitutional. So how is this possible? Well, in those administrative documents, the civilian exclusion order that was put up on March 24th, 1942, as well as everywhere else, you can see the first lines, all persons alien and non-alien. And the Supreme Court said, well, now you're no longer a person, you first generation Japanese, you are an alien, and the Japanese American citizens are no longer citizens. You are now a subclass of non-alien. It's basically out of whole cloth. And they said the United States government, under times of war and military necessity, can do extraordinary things for its own security. And we've all read this. And this is the lesson we try to hope for. This is what you see when you go to the National Historic Site in Manzanar. You will see the picture of the USS Arizona sinking on December 7th, 1941. And below it, September 11th, 2001, the island of Manhattan in New York after the Twin Towers had fallen from the terrorist attack. And the quotation up front by Benjamin Franklin. This is how people reacted after Pearl Harbor's bombing. And this is how a lot of people reacted after the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001. Now, war is an unusual thing, and most of us, if we're not psychopaths or sociopaths, we can't kill on demand. So what the military has to do is inspire soldiers, inspire people to, sorry about that, inspire soldiers to fight the enemy because they're evil. You're going to turn out to protect your homeland. And the Germans in World War I took this to literally a new art form. And we'd never seen propaganda like this. Here's the artist's depiction of this very menacing Bolshevik to the German mother, or you're not even human. You make your enemy into non-human. And a lot of their propaganda, quite frankly, I can't share with you because it borders on, well, I would say it is actually pornographic. And it was shocking to the world to see this kind of incredible use of art to do that. And we as the United States said that we have a higher standard, even though they might be our enemy, that they are still humans. So therefore, we would never stoop to that kind of level of what the Germans did in World War I. But after the war began, and after September 11th, this next one I'm going to share with you was a very popular item that people wore, many with pride. It's similar to showing your support for troops, perhaps with a yellow ribbon pin or a flag lapel pin or something like that, that showed your support for the nation and for your people in uniform. And these were handed out by businesses, by nonprofit groups, by churches, by schools, even our U.S. government. Now, in the late 1970s, early 80s, they started out trying to look into this period of history. And they finally, after many years, there was a group called the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians to look at the history of Japanese American incarceration, study it with constitutional experts and historians. And they found that there was no evidence after 2 years and hearings and more than 750 witnesses, nearly 500 pages. This report found that there was no documented evidence of espionage nor sabotage, nor was there any military necessity for the mass exclusion and incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans. But they unanimously found what the United States did in the forced removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans in World War II were based on these three things and these three things only. It found that the policy of exclusion, removal, and detention was systematically conducted by the U.S. government, despite the fact that no documented evidence of espionage or sabotage was shown, and there was no direct military necessity for the detention. This led to the signing of the Civil Liberties Act in 1988 by President Ronald Reagan, and this started to begin part of honoring. Here on Bainbridge Island, we have to really single out these two people. They were the editors of the Bainbridge Review. They were in their 30s, buying this newspaper in 1941. 9 months after they arrived, Pearl Harbor happened. They wrote an editorial the day after saying, "Let's not rush to mob rule. These are our friends and neighbors." There's no evidence of disloyalty. On February 19th, when Roosevelt signed that Executive Order 9066, it was a blistering editorial by the Woodwards saying, "Mr. President, have you not read the United States Constitution? These are U.S. citizens." And he's the only newspaper in the entire war in the United States that held that editorial stance against the unconstitutional actions of the United States government. And he also did something else that no other newspaper did, and that was had people write back from the camps. He had a camp correspondent. You can see some of these articles. Some of them were really short, but they kept people informed. He said it was important for people to know what was happening to their friends and neighbors behind barbed wire, because when this is over, we just want to get back up to speed. And because of that leadership, and because of this island starting out from its early roots as a place of industry at the mill and at the shipyard, it was a very tight-knit community. More than 150 of the 276 Japanese Americans who left Bainbridge Island came back, had more either owned property. We might have been in the low 200s. There is not a community up and down the West Coast that came close to 15%. Liberal places like today, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, were under 15%. There's a place north of Seattle here called Bellingham that passed an official resolution saying you are forbidden to return. So Bainbridge is incredibly different in how they responded to this action. But it was not Pollyanna. This white supremacist on the island wrote this booklet, The Practical Approach to the Racial Problem. And Lambert Schuyler did very, very well. He made a fair amount of coin off of this pamphlet. It's all documented in this book by their daughter, Mary Woodward, and we hope you seek it out. And the one thing we wanted to have as a place, we finally came to become a National Historic Site on Bainbridge Island. That became in 2008. And we want this to be a place of healing. And here's a picture of them marching down to the ferry that morning. And we built it on the very site where they marched down the ferry from Taylor Road. It's on the opposite side of Eagle Harbor. That's where the Eagle Dale Ferry Dock was. You come to the site, you see this introduction panel, and we have this timber frame pavilion. And behind the pavilion are informational panels, of which the story I've just shared with you. You walk down to the wall, you come to this trio of panels, which are dated on March 30th, 1942. All of these photographs were taken that morning by the Seattle Post-Intelligencer newspaper, and reporters there. That's how we know the story about the emojis and their dog and the rest, because they were there, reporters chronicling what happened. You then enter the site, go across a bridge over a wetland, and you come to the wall. That's granite, and the motto of our place is Nidoto Nayoni, or let it not happen again. It's exactly 276 feet long, 1 foot for every Japanese American who lived on Bainbridge Island. And we have the introductory panel. Every family is put together by their last name. You can also see their ages. And this first panel, the quotation on it reads, "I came to Bainbridge Island in 1908. Bainbridge was a good place to raise a family. Tomokichi Nishinaka." I was born and raised on Bainbridge Island, and I'm a 100% American citizen. We will protect our flag, the United States flag. Masaki John Nakata. Just a week before we were to leave, Coach Pop Miller put in all of the Japanese Americans. Despite our errors in not hitting, he let us play the whole game. We lost 15-2. I felt like a second-class citizen to be herded on the boats by soldiers with bayonets. It was the most humiliating experience of my life at Sami Nakao. We were really careful. We were prisoners, and they had guns with spears. The searchlights played on our windows back and forth all night. I couldn't sleep. Back home at graduation, they had 13 empty chairs on the stage. That day, I felt so empty and sad. I sat on my bunk and I cried. This break in the wall represents their removal from Bainbridge Island because the wall is about Japanese Americans on Bainbridge, but of course, for 3 years there were none. So this basalt monolith represents the Minidoka concentration camp in southern Idaho. This is a final return panel. You'll see that something we did here. We made it 3 together. You'll also notice something else we deliberately did. We made it full color. The other ones were fairly monochromatic because of the exceptional nature of Bainbridge Island and welcoming their friends and neighbors and standing up for the Constitution. We wanted this to be the biggest and brightest part when you leave. This reads, I was kind of afraid, but the neighbor girl that I used to play with came up and welcomed me, Ikyo Suimatsu Shibayama. We put the farm under Mr. Raber's name while we were gone. When we came back, he returned it to us, Noburo Kura. My father and his brother worked so hard to build up Bainbridge Gardens. When we returned, there was nothing left. It must have broken him, Junko Harui. So you leave our site, you go up this path, and then there's all these panels along the way. Then you go through this wooded walkway, you go across the bridge, you come to the pavilion again, and we have future plans for this site. We will put up an outdoor amphitheater for 30, 40 people and also have a timber frame pavilion that will speak to the pavilion and the wall and gates that you previously saw at this visitor center. This is our hope. This is Dr. Frank Kitamoto's famous quote. This was one of his last speeches he gave before he passed away in 2013. And he was the president of the Japanese American community for well over a quarter century. And I believe he's right. I believe it is fear that charges all of the problems that happened in World War II. And this is our motto, Nidoto Nayoni, or let it not happen again. This is hopefully aspirational, and definitely we want it to be an inspiration. But let's address the 10,000-pound elephant in the room. It isn't. It's happening again. We're having a rise of anti-Asian fear and hate, and the horrific things that happened in Georgia recently. So I'd like to read a statement I wrote on behalf of our community about all of this. The Bainbridge Island Japanese American community deplores the alarming rise of anti-Asian racism, hate, and violence, and we share in the Asian community's collective grief of the horrific killings of Asian women in Atlanta. Ever since the former president uttered and continues to use to this day the racist tropes China virus and Kung flu, we were afraid that horrific events like this would eventually happen. Left unchecked, history has shown that fear, racism, hate, and vengeance lead to the predictable, horrible, and destructive destinations. The history on Bainbridge Island suggests a different destiny. In World War II, our greater community stood tall against the nationally sanctioned tidal wave of fear, racism, and prejudice against Japanese Americans. Our community stood by their Japanese American friends, classmates, neighbors, and co-workers by keeping in touch and protecting their properties. Our community's newspaper, the Bainbridge Review, displayed uncommon editorial courage, being the only newspaper in the nation to consistently oppose and object to the unconstitutional actions of our government. Our community held open their arms and hearts at the end of the war, encouraging and welcoming home more than half of their Japanese American friends and neighbors. Our community has built a memorial wall, Nidoto Nayoni, Let It Not Happen Again, to educate and remind us of our dark history and the vigilance we all must have to protect our rights. Our nation should take inspiration from our island's uncommon patriotic legacy. Our nation must stand together and say with one undeniable voice that we will not tolerate intolerance, violence, and deliberate violations of our liberties and Constitution. And that is our hope. Thank you very much.